Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into some really critical research. It's all about global conservation, biodiversity, and this persistent challenge of biological invasions. Yeah, the paper we're getting into is called Biological Invasions on Indigenous Peoples' Lands. Hanno Seebens is the lead author, published in Nature Sustainability. It's got this huge global scope. And our mission today really is to give you the shortcut. We want to explore how it quantifies the threat of these alien species, specifically on Indigenous Peoples' Lands, IPLs for short, and try to settle that big debate. What's really behind their ecological resilience?
It's such an important debate, too. I mean, biological invasions, bringing non-native species into new areas, it's widely seen as a top driver of biodiversity loss globally. Right up
Yeah.
there with habitat destruction, actually. And things like globalization, trade, they're just speeding it all up dramatically.
Right. And the Indigenous Peoples' Lands, these IPLs, they often feel like the front line in this. When you look at conservation globally, you just can't ignore them.
Absolutely not. They cover a massive area. It's something like 28% of the Earth's land surface across, what, 87 countries?
Huge.
And the data just keeps confirming how vital they are. You generally see lower rates of biodiversity loss compared to other areas. Plus, they hold on to a lot of the planet's ecological intactness.
Yeah, put some numbers on that intactness for you. The study mentions 67% of IPLs are considered natural, meaning minimal human footprint. Compare that to just 44% for all other lands.
Wow, it's a big difference.
It really is. And they contain about 36% of all the world's remaining intact forests. So yeah, their importance is just immense.
hmm But the common assumption, the sort of initial hypothesis people jump to, is that this resilience is just, well, geography, an accident.
Right, the idea that they're just remote.
Exactly. That they're less affected simply because they're often far from global trade hubs, far from big cities.
Yeah.
So naturally, fewer species get introduced. It's the remoteness shield idea.
But this research team asked, okay, is it just that remoteness, or is there maybe something else going on? Something more active, perhaps related to land stewardship, to the traditional practices of indigenous peoples?
That's the crucial question they tried to untangle. So first, they had to define IPLs rigorously. They used a definition like terrestrial lands managed or owned by indigenous peoples. And they used this global map covering nearly 38 million square kilometers. It's huge, bigger than North America.
Wow. And the data side must have been immense, too, integrating all that.
Oh, absolutely. They took spatial data on where the IPLs are and then layered on top records of where alien species have been found. They ended up cataloging, I think, over 128,000 records, representing more than 6,000 different alien species specifically found on IPLs around the world.
Just incredible scale.
It really is. And what's interesting is that when they first looked at just the raw numbers without any controls, there's a pretty strong link.
Okay.
Well, countries with lots of invasive species overall. They also tended to have lots of invasive species on the IPLs within their borders. Think Australia, for example. High numbers everywhere.
Okay, so the surrounding pressure definitely plays a role.
It does, which meant, they couldn't just compare raw numbers. To figure out if stewardship offered extra protection, they really had to filter out all that background noise, all the confounding factors.
Right. They needed a fair comparison. So what did they have to control for? What were the key variables?
They zeroed in on the big factors known to drive invasions. Essentially, they tried to make an IPL area and a non-IPL area statistically comparable, even if they look different on the surface. Four main things. First, and this is a big one, sampling bias.
Ah, right. If you don't look, you don't find.
Precisely. IPLs are often remote, harder to access for researchers. So the data show they were actually undersampled by about 5 times compared to other lands. You have to account for that huge difference in effort.
Okay, that's a major adjustment they needed to make right off the bat. What else?
Second, physical accessibility. Basically, how easy is it to get there? They look at road density, travel time to the nearest city, that sort of thing.
Makes sense. More roads, more potential introductions.
Third was human impact and development. They use things like satellite data on nighttime lights as a proxy. It tells you about population density, wealth, infrastructure.
Kind of a measure of human footprint.
Exactly. And then finally, they also controlled for the baseline ecological intactness of the land itself using an index called mean species abundance.
Okay, so controlling for sampling, access, human impact, and existing ecology. And I bet that accessibility data immediately showed that IPLs are generally more remote.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The raw data confirmed that baseline. Compared to other lands, IPLs had like 5 times lower nighttime light levels. Road densities were nearly 3 times lower, travel times to cities Much longer.
So physically, they're less disturbed, less connected. That part holds up.
Yes, that's the baseline reality. But the real discovery, the core finding, came after they applied all those statistical controls, when they compared IPLs to non-IPL lands that were similar in terms of remoteness, road density, light levels.
Okay, this is the critical part. After leveling the playing field statistically, what did they find? What's the headline result?
It's pretty striking. Even after controlling for all those factors, IPLs still hosted significantly fewer alien species, about 30% fewer on average than comparable non-IPL areas.
30%.
30% fewer.
Wow.
In absolute terms, that worked out to roughly 11 fewer alien species per comparable grid cell.
Wow. Okay, so if it's not just because they're remote and it's not just because they have less infrastructure after you control for that, what does that strongly suggest?
It really points towards active resistance. It implies that the difference isn't just passive geography. It suggests that something about the land management, the stewardship practices used by indigenous peoples, is creating ecosystems that are inherently more resistant to invasion.
So the way the land is managed actually builds resilience.
That's the strong implication. It's not just where the land is, but how it's cared for. It seems intrinsic to the management approach.
That feels like a really powerful finding, kind of validating traditional ecological knowledge through this massive data set. Did this protective effect hold true across different types of species, plants, animals?
Mostly, yes. The pattern of lower invasion numbers on IPLs was pretty consistent across vascular plants, arthropods, insects and spiders, mammals, and even fish.
Okay.
The effect was strongest, actually, for arthropods and plants. Which makes sense, right? Those are often the species introduced unintentionally, hitching rides with human movement and goods.
Yeah, if you have less disturbance, fewer pathways,
Yeah.
you'd expect fewer accidental introductions of weeds and bugs.
Exactly. The one area where the difference was less strong, or sometimes not significant, was for things like birds. Highly mobile species.
Ah, because they can just fly in, regardless of roads or management.
Pretty much. Even with great land management, it's harder to stop a bird arriving if it wants to. So the benefit seems more concentrated on preventing establishment once a species arrives, which is harder for things that move easily over long distances.
Okay, that nuance makes sense. Now, even with this overall 30% lower number, invasions aren't uniform. The paper talks about hotspots areas within IPLs that actually had more invaders than expected. What drove those?
Yeah, the hotspots were basically areas where the protective effects seemed to be overwhelmed. They're characterized by, well, the usual suspects. Higher road densities, easier accessibility, more nighttime light, more settlements nearby.
So basically where modern infrastructure encroachment was highest.
That's right. When a human footprint crosses a certain threshold, even on IPLs, the resistance seems to weaken or break down.
And where did they find most of these hotspots?
Interestingly, Australia had the highest proportion, about 37% of these high invasion IPL cells, then Russia with 23%, and the US around 9%.
Australia really stands out there. It sounds like it's a place where you see both ends of the spectrum.
It's a perfect case study, actually. You see those invasion hotspots concentrated near the big urban centers, particularly in eastern Australia. Lots of infrastructure, and crucially, often places where historical factors have compromised or limited traditional indigenous management.
Right.
But then you look at remote central and northwestern Australia, and you see the opposite. Extremely low invasion numbers. And significantly, these are often areas where indigenous ranger programs are active, specifically managing feral animals, controlling weeds. It's proof of concept active stewardship works when the rights and resources are there.
That contrast really underscores the point, but also hints at the complexity, doesn't it? Because the relationship indigenous peoples have with non-native species isn't always straightforwardly negative.
Oh, absolutely not. It's incredibly nuanced. While, yes, most alien species are seen as threats from a conservation standpoint, the paper acknowledges this complexity. Some species introduced maybe centuries ago, maybe not even by Europeans, but by earlier traders, have become integrated into local culture or livelihoods.
I remember reading about the feral water buffalo example in northern Australia. Ecologically, they're a huge problem, right? Damaging wetlands.
Massive ecological problem. They cause significant damage, and there are control programs for exactly that reason. But for some indigenous groups in that same region, the buffalo has become culturally significant, even a totem animal for some clans. And it's also become an important source of food and income through hunting or mustering.
So you've got this one species that's simultaneously an ecological threat, a cultural element, and an economic resource.
Exactly. Which means management isn't simple. You can't just impose a top-down eradication policy without considering those local realities and potentially harming livelihoods or cultural practices. It highlights the need for co-management and really listening to local perspectives.
Right. It demands solutions developed with Indigenous communities, not just for them.
Precisely. The study doesn't prescribe specific management actions, but it powerfully frames why Indigenous agency and knowledge are critical for finding sustainable solutions.
Okay, so let's try and pull the threads together here. The big picture, the synthesis. What's the main takeaway from this study?
I think it adds really strong quantitative evidence to this growing understanding that IPLs are absolutely vital for global conservation. They're refuges for native species. And crucially, their resilience isn't just passive. It's not just because they're remote. There seems to be an active component linked to stewardship.
But like all good research, it acknowledges its limits, right?
Yes, and it's important we note those too. For instance, using that simple split IPLs versus other lands is a necessary simplification for a global study, but it kind of papers over a complex history.
How so?
Well, many of those other lands were historically indigenous lands where traditional management was actively suppressed or eliminated. So the baseline for comparison isn't perfectly clean. The legacy of colonialism affects the whole map.
That's a really important point. And they also mentioned the challenge of measuring impact, didn't they? They counted the number of alien species, but not all species are equally damaging.
Exactly. The number of species is a useful proxy, especially at a global scale, where detailed impact data is often patchy or just missing. But ideally, you'd want to know the ecological consequences of those species, not just their presence. That data is still lacking in many places.
Which points towards where research needs to go next.
Definitely. To really understand how this protective effect works, we need more fine-grained local studies. We need to understand the specific land management practices being used in different regions by different peoples.
And working directly with Indigenous communities, presumably?
Absolutely critical. It means genuine engagement, learning from Indigenous knowledge holders, and co-developing research questions and approaches. That's exactly what international agreements like the Coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework are calling for, recognizing and supporting the role of Indigenous peoples in conservation.
So connecting it all up, this isn't just an interesting ecological finding. It has real policy implications. It's scientific backing for the idea that empowering Indigenous communities to manage their lands is actually a powerful conservation strategy.
Yes, it demonstrates that traditional knowledge and practices aren't just culturally valuable, though they certainly are, but they produce measurable, positive ecological outcomes. That 30% reduction in invasions isn't trivial. It shows a real quantifiable benefit that goes beyond what geography alone explains.
So the core message for you, the listener, is really quite powerful. When Indigenous peoples have the rights, the agency, and importantly the resources to manage their lands according to their knowledge systems, the result tends to be healthier, more resilient ecosystems. Ecosystems that are demonstrably better at resisting global threats like biological invasions. We've seen the evidence now that these traditional management practices make a significant difference boosting resistance well beyond what just being remote can achieve. So thinking about that, here's something to mull over. Given the scientific validation, what global policies, what funding structures really need a rethink? How do we ensure that Indigenous rights and agency and environmental stewardship aren't just acknowledged on paper, but are truly universally respected and actively supported on the ground? That 30% difference might just hold a key to a more resilient planet for everyone.